He was standing outside his own home when the flashing lights appeared. 3 men in fake uniforms stepped out, claiming to be HOA police. They said he didn't belong there, that someone like him must have been trespassing. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, whispering. He stayed calm, hands visible, heart steady, because what those men didn't know was that they had just picked a fight with the most feared FBI agent in the state. They thought they had found a threat, but they had no idea who the real threat was. Malcolm Hayes had spent his life in silence and service. For over 20 years, he'd worked in the shadows, tracking violent crimes, dismantling corruption, protecting people who'd never know his name. He was the kind of man who didn't need recognition. He only wanted peace. After decades in the field, he finally earned a quiet home in a suburban neighborhood outside Atlanta. It was supposed to be his reward, a calm life with clean sidewalks and polite smiles. But in peaceful places, prejudice often hides in plain sight. First, it was small things. Cars slowing when he jogged, curious stares lingering too long, flyers from a community watch that no one had asked for. The new homeowners association claimed to keep the neighborhood safe, but Malcolm knew that word, safe, was sometimes used to mean something else entirely. He noticed the same pattern he'd studied for years: polite prejudice disguised as protection. He'd seen it in reports, in victim stories, in history itself. Still, he chose to ignore it, believing calm would keep the peace. But peace doesn't last when hate is looking for attention. One evening, that quiet life ended with the flash of fake police lights. He'd spent a career hunting danger, but this time, danger had come looking for him. Started like any other night. The sky dimmed into deep orange, the kind of evening that promised nothing unusual. But as Malcolm parked his car, an SUV rolled toward him slowly, its headlights flickering red and blue. 3 men stepped out. Their uniforms were cheap copies of authority, badges that glinted too bright, belts without regulation numbers, and vests reading Community Enforcement Unit. Malcolm's instincts kicked in instantly. Their posture, their tone, their lack of radio communication. These weren't officers. These were pretenders playing power. They accused him of trespassing, claiming someone had reported a suspicious person. He didn't argue. His calm made them uncomfortable. He handed over his ID, and the tallest one, broad shoulders, mirrored glasses, glanced at it, pretending to verify. Malcolm noticed the man's hand tremble slightly. It wasn't authority, it was insecurity. The leader sneered, circling him. "You people always think you can move wherever you want," he said under his breath. The words cut through the night like broken glass. Malcolm stayed still, his mind sharp and deliberate. He'd seen worse, on streets where real power was abused, but the sting never dulled. As the fake officers laughed and walked away, something caught his eye. A small sticker on their SUV. It bore a symbol, an eye within a circle. He recognized it instantly. It belonged to a group he'd quietly investigated years ago. The Watch, a self-proclaimed neighborhood safety network that operated across states, targeting black families under the guise of community order. When the SUV disappeared into the night, Malcolm went inside. No panic, no anger, just precision. Within minutes, his computer screen lit up with information. He followed the digital trail: fake HOA documents, chat groups, payments routed through shell accounts. Every thread led back to the same group. They weren't a few men with flashlights. They were an organized ring built on fear. By morning, his plan was ready. The next evening, the SUV returned. Their arrogance hadn't changed. They expected silence again. But this time, Malcolm stood in the driveway wearing a dark jacket marked with gold letters, FBI. When they saw it, confusion flashed across their faces. Still, they tried to act tough, asking if he had a problem. He didn't respond. He simply raised his phone and began recording. Seconds later, 2 unmarked federal vehicles turned the corner. Doors opened. Agents stepped out. The men froze. Their fake authority vanished as quickly as their confidence. In that instant, they realized this time the man they had tried to intimidate was the law. In the interrogation room, the air felt heavy. The 3 men sat pale and sweating, their fake badges laid out like broken lies on the table. Behind the glass, Malcolm watched quietly. Years in the bureau had taught him to control emotion, but beneath that calm exterior, a storm brewed. He didn't want revenge. He wanted exposure. Federal charges came quickly: impersonating law enforcement, harassment, and hate crimes. Their organization unraveled overnight, its online forums taken down, its members under investigation. But Malcolm knew how these stories often ended, with silence. Headlines would fade, public anger would cool, and history would move on. This time, he refused to let it disappear. He approved the release of the footage. Every second, the fake uniforms, the mocking words, the moment they realized who they'd confronted. The video spread across the nation. People watched in disbelief as arrogance turned to fear, and judgment turned to justice. The same neighbors who had once watched him through their blinds now stood by his side, ashamed they hadn't spoken sooner. It wasn't about humiliation, it was about truth. For too long, hate had worn disguises. That night, the mask finally fell. Weeks later, the street returned to its routine. The lawns were still perfect, the mailboxes still uniform. But something had changed in the air, an honesty that hadn't existed before. People began stopping by to speak with Malcolm. Some apologized. Others simply said thank you. The silence had broken. Malcolm returned to his quiet habits. Morning jogs, tending to his small garden, feeding the stray cat that always waited by his porch. Yet, every time he passed the spot where the fake lights had flashed, he remembered, peace isn't given, it's protected. He decided to turn that night into something meaningful. On weekends, he hosted open talks at his home. Small gatherings where neighbors discussed bias, fear, and the quiet ways discrimination spreads. There were no lectures, no titles, just people listening and learning. He never told them who he really was. The badge stayed tucked away in a drawer. His voice carried the authority of experience, not rank. One evening, a woman who had watched from her window that night approached him. Her eyes filled with regret. She said his calm had changed her view of courage. That sometimes, strength isn't in shouting, but in standing tall when the world doubts you. Malcolm smiled softly and said, "Justice doesn't always wear a badge." The story could have ended there, but it didn't. His message rippled beyond that neighborhood, shared by people who saw themselves in his silence, in his patience, in his strength. The night had begun with false power, but it ended with real justice. And as the screen fades to black, one question lingers. If hate can organize in silence, why can't compassion?